Welcome to Mac Advantage, Professional Perspectives in Accounting. My name is Scott Showalter, and I'm the director of the Jenkins Master Accounting Program at NC State. Today, we're very fortunate to have Jeffery Hales join us. Jeff is a board member of the International Sustainability Standards Board, or ISSB. Before joining the ISSB, he chaired the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. Easy for me to say, right? Jeff does all of this while serving on the faculty at the University of Texas at Austin. So you can say he's pretty busy from that perspective. Based on Jeff's long experience with sustainability reporting, we will explore the history of sustainability and the future of reporting as we know it today. So we're just going to jump right in with the first question for Jeff. So Jeff, I gave a little bit of a background, but you definitely have a variety of roles in your career. Your career track has clearly not probably followed the traditional academic path either. Please provide a brief summary of kind of your experiences for our audience today.
Sure. Well, first, thanks, Scott, for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to sit down and chat with you. You're right. Like, I haven't followed the traditional academic path in that I have had the opportunity to be pretty involved in standard setting over the years. But that was definitely not the goal when I started out. I thought I just wanted to be a typical accounting professor and teach accounting and do research. And, that's the good life. And it is a good life, actually. It's something that I really enjoy. But I also have had during my career the opportunity to take a pause and be on staff at the Financial Accounting Standards Board. And then I've had the chance to then get involved with the development of sustainability accounting standards, first through ISSB, and then, as you mentioned, as a member of the ISSB. And through both of those organizations, I guess I've also had the opportunity to then be involved in a number of other initiatives, but those were really the primary ones.
Okay. Well, we mentioned there your career being a lot around sustainability, and that wasn't your original intent. So what was it along the way? Explain how you got interested in focusing both your academic and your outside interests on sustainability. What was the triggering event along the way? Maybe it wasn't an event that got you where you are.
Yeah, I mean, there was definitely a point where the opportunity arose, and it wasn't something that I had foreseen. But I think you could probably say it was a sequence of events. I think the first thing was that I was given a class to teach when I started my career at the University of Texas that required me to really understand not just what the standards were, but how they get developed. But I didn't really know, and so I was working to, as a good teacher, to try to understand that. And so I was engaging with the Financial Accounting Standards Board, and then luckily that led to an opportunity to actually be on staff. And when I was there at the FASB, that's what first really gave me an appreciation for the value of standards developments, high quality due process, the challenges that inevitably, and you would appreciate this yourself. It's easy to criticize standards, but it's hard to actually develop a better approach. And so, I had that first opportunity at the FASB, and that really was transformative for how I would think about the way I would teach accounting and the way I would think about what were interesting research issues. But then what really happened in my career is that there was a moment where, after sort of struggling with that publish or perish for a number of years, things finally started to turn around for me, and I kind of found my footing, in a sense, in the publishing world. And with that came, as tenure often does, it brings sort of thoughts of like, well, what's next, and what do I really want to be involved with? And I really wanted to be involved with something that was important, something that needed my unique set of skills, and I didn't know exactly what that was. And as luck would have it, I didn't know what that was, but somebody else did, and it was the founder of ISSB, a woman named Jean Rogers, and she called me and convinced me that I had a role to play in this startup, a nonprofit that she had established to try to set out this wildly ambitious kind of vision, and sort of saw the unique value that I could bring to just as one piece in that organization. And so that was back in 2012 that she reached out to me. And so now it's been, easily over a decade now of being involved more directly with sustainability work.
Great. Let's build on your comment about the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. Yeah, you joined, actually ultimately became the chair of that board. So probably most people maybe never heard that. Don't take it personally, but probably never heard of the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. So if you can talk about what it was and your assessment of what it accomplished during this period of time.
Yeah. So, the idea behind SASB was really the sense that investors need information to make investment decision-making needs. And financial statements are designed to deliver part of that. But they've never really been envisioned, I think, as being the only thing that would influence investor decisions. So you really need more information than just what you can capture in, the assets and liabilities that a company has today. I mean, just beyond those existing assets and obligations a company might have are the risks and the opportunities of tomorrow. And a lot of those risks and opportunities relate to things that companies depend on, but they can't entirely control. I mean, if you could exercise more control over some of these things, they probably would be captured in financial statements already. So the vision behind SASB was to think about, a lot of those things are environmental issues and they are social issues, whether they are, how you're dealing with your employees or how you're dealing with your customers or how you're dealing with, the communities in which companies have significant operations. And so the idea was to try to not just encourage companies to disclose more information about that, but information that would be material to investors. And the idea was that in order to do that, you had to think about what kind of a business is it? And so that's where the industry approach came in.
Great. Well, after you left Sustainability Accounting Standards, where you weren't done with standard setting or sustainability, you became a member of the International Sustainability Standards Board in actually June of 2022. Again, could you a little time explain what that board is about and what have you been able to accomplish since that board got established?
Yeah, so I think what SASB was able to do was to really reach the investor community and find like a real resonance there. And so one of the things that was really significant in SASB's journey was when we stopped just hearing calls from investors for better information on sustainability issues, and they really started talking about, needing companies to disclose against the SASB standards and also TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And those two things, I think, are a really, great combination of guidance that helps to meet more completely investor needs. But they really started. I mean, they were separate efforts, different approaches, but in a way very complementary to each other. So what happened is that the IFRS Foundation recognized that while SASB and some of these other things like the TCFD and related organizations were getting increased uptake, and a lot of it on a voluntary basis. There's something like over 4,000 companies around the world that use SASB on a mostly on a voluntary basis. But what the foundation recognized is that as jurisdictions were starting to get involved with like coming up with specific requirements for companies to make sure that the needs in those jurisdictions were being met, the foundation realized that this could end up looking a lot like accounting standards looked pre-2000s, where a lot of domestic gap setters. So there's the FASB in the U.S., the Financial Accounting Standards Board, but it's like every country has their own ASB, and that's that had gotten us to a particular point from a global capital markets perspective. But back in the 2000s, right around 2000, we recognized that was not going to be what the market, the solution the market ultimately needed. So the IASB was formed, and part of their job was to get countries to stop setting their own domestic gap and to point to international gap. And so and they've been very successful in doing that. More than 140 countries around the world do that from an accounting standards perspective. So they thought, like, before we end up in the same position, is there a way that we can sort of front run this and try to establish a global baseline for sustainability disclosures that would meet investor needs? And if they were going to do that, this is the wise part, they didn't want to just add in another, ISSB in a sense to the mix. They actually had reached out to the different organizations that were doing something, trying to accomplish the same thing in terms of the investor need, and they were able to consolidate those investor-oriented frameworks together. So although there are still a number of standard setters that are out there, and I think there will continue to be, from an investor perspective, it's really now the ISSB, which still points to the SASB standards and has now responsibility for that as part of the consolidation that happened. And I had the good fortune of then getting the opportunity to serve as a member on the ISSB to kind of continue this work. And so far it's been a really great way to consolidate the different organizations, to simplify that, but also to take it from not just primarily a voluntary approach to getting companies to use the standards, but really reaching out to jurisdictions and saying, hey, if you're considering this, if you're considering sustainability disclosure requirements for capital markets, we think we're a good solution for that, and really helping jurisdictions to understand the value of what the ISSB standards, supported by SASB standards, can actually accomplish. And so we've got more than 40 jurisdictions that have already decided or are in the process of deciding exactly how they're going to use the ISSB standards in mandatory requirements in their jurisdictions for at least some, usually like large public companies, but potentially beyond that as well. So moving from that voluntary to mandatory perspective in some ways.
Good. I'm sure particularly global companies really appreciate your efforts here, because as you know, one of their nightmares is having to deal with a whole quilt of different patchwork of different standards around the world. And my observation would be with yours is that I see generally people understanding the value of what you're doing and the willingness to move in that way.
Well, I will say, just on that specific point, having been involved with standard setting for a long time, standard setters often don't get complimented on the work that they're doing. But I have been thanked actually by companies more than once for these efforts. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't also have suggestions and criticisms as well, but but the thanks are always appreciated. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think a standard setter has ever not been given some suggestions for things they could do differently.
That's right.
So particularly if you think about sustainability reporting and from a global perspective and reflective of the U.S. in addition to that, publicity about sustainability reporting, it really has its ebbs and flows. It goes up and it goes down depending on what particularly the issue is. So since you have spent most of your career focused on this, how do you assess the current state of sustainability? How would you put us today as you look around the world? And again, you and I were chatting before you came on about your travels. I see you all the time on LinkedIn around the world. So how would you assess where we are today?
The way I think about it is that, first of all, ebbs and flows are natural. They're actually a necessity, because our circumstances are constantly changing. So whatever is a priority or a focus today won't always be the priority or focus of tomorrow, because the business world evolves, the world around us evolves. So that ought to be normal. And so I appreciate that. That's just part of what makes it a challenge to do good standard setting, is to make sure that we're thinking about what's going to be kind of like resilient guidance that we can provide that will have some longevity to it, and not only meet the pressures of today. I mean, a great example of that, I think, would be from a sustainability perspective. We know that health and safety is a big issue for your employees in certain industries, where it's just like, if you're in the mining industry and you're sending your workers down under the ground, that there's an inherent risk to that. So that's long been understood. If you're a consumer products company where you're selling something that, people put onto or into their bodies, I mean, that is, again, like, inherently, like, safety of your customers' health is, that's an important issue that we've always kind of like known. Those are important issues. But think that, when the pandemic came came onto the scene, suddenly every company, software companies, were talking about how they were going to think about the health and safety of their employees, which had not ever really been on the radar. But that doesn't mean you go out and you set standards suddenly for those issues, because we were all hoping that this was going to be a temporary thing, and thankfully that was. But so it's really about, I think, partly recognizing there are ebbs and flows, and we want to think about how will we set standards that will have a good shelf life, in a sense. No standard is ever going to be the right standard for forever, but we ought to have a way to think through that. So that's one thing. I think where we are today is that we're in a period where, I think, as we talked about this, going from kind of like relying heavily on voluntary uptake of sustainability reporting to more of a mandatory approach. It's very normal as part of that process to say, all right, actually, if this is not just going to be a choice that companies can take, but something that we're going to require of at least certain companies, then it's fair to say, do we have the right standards? Do we have the right issues? Is the cost that we're going to put into the system, a reasonable cost? So I think we're in a period of time, what I've been thinking of is sort of like the reckoning, where jurisdictions have to ask those questions. And so when I think about, where we are right now, I try to remember that, well, first of all, sustainability issues can be thought about in a number of different ways. One way, the way I often think about them, is that they're business issues. Now, that doesn't mean like, every business issue can be, is thought of as a sustainability issue, or that, like, when we think about sustainability issues like, water or, employee safety or something like that, that we're only ever thinking through that. I mean, there are also public policy issues, and they're also, a philanthropic issue as well. When you think about what we might want information about, what we might hope companies would do. But I think that's sort of important to think about those different lenses, because when it's a business issue versus a public policy issue versus more of like a philanthropic issue, then I think the approach that you take, and then also how you think that might change across time with the ebbs and flows, will be a bit different. From my perspective, this is the nature of how the world works. I think you get wider swings in public policy issues because there'll be points in time where, something is on the radar of citizens of a nation, and they'll say, like, this is something that we really care about. And so that's when you get regulators, legislators, starting to address it. But then, those times can pass as well, and we start to focus as a society on different issues. Business issues also will vary over time. But the way I think about those is those vary more as, as your competitive pressures change, as new technologies change, as there'll be times where, if a market is in crisis, everybody's focused on the short term. When things stabilize and companies can, start thinking about longer term planning, then they start to do some of the, focus on longer term issues, and investors will ask questions about that. So I think the business issues, in some ways, have that kind of like longer shelf life, in a sense. They're a little more predictable. They also change, in terms of like, when there's going to be those changes in time horizon. Market crises tend to bring all sorts of focus to them. But that's how I kind of think about it. Is I think we're in a little bit of this reckoning, and I think that's normal in some ways.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I hadn't heard that term, but reckoning makes a lot of sense. Reckoning from a regulator perspective, reckoning from a company perspective, and the government perspective. Yeah, totally understand that. And so now, since you've sort of talked about where we are today, as you look out, you want to provide any forecast, any projections, or any thoughts about where maybe this is more aspirational, where you like for it to go, or where you see sustainability reporting to go? Anywhere there you want to claim, feel free to go.
Sure. Yeah. I think I hope where we land, as part of this reckoning, is that we land in a good spot where where jurisdictions around the world have taken um, a a good assessment of the risks and the benefits, the costs, and the upside of thinking about what are the important sustainability issues that are going to be crucial for well-functioning capital markets. I think we should, my hope is that they will continue to support those efforts, because I think those are the ones that, the way I think about them is like, if you focus on the right business issues, sustainability issues or not, focusing on the right ones, that is an effort that pays for itself. And so really, that's something that we ought to continue to focus on. When we think about those ones that uh, focusing on the issue itself won't, as from a business perspective, pay for itself, but it might still be something that, like, that as a society we've said that's important. I mean, the way I think about this is a great example is accessibility to business. You can always make your business a little more accessible, and that will bring in, potentially one more customer or one more employee, but like, a lot of those just wouldn't be justified from a business perspective. So what we then say from a societal perspective is, well, there's going to be some minimum that we expect, because we know that, the society we live in is going to expect at least some degree of accessibility to businesses, for employees and for workers. That's for public policy to decide as well. So, when I think like where I hope we land is that as those issues get reckoned with, that if there's a change in public policy, that it doesn't end up also sort of swallowing up some of the business issues that would also, in a sense, kind of, pay for itself, right? If we've identified the right issues. So that's where I hope we land. Is it a good spot where we've identified the issues that we believe strongly in, that are important for capital markets, and we expect companies to provide those, with reasonable cost considerations. And then for the public policy issues that different jurisdictions decide, what are the important issues for right now, for the near future, for the mid and long term, and even if those are different in some countries than in others, they should be making the right decisions for those companies as well. But that's, public policy issues tend to be beyond, I think, my my area of expertise. I think that's a more difficult nut to crack, in a sense, than the capital markets one, which I think are more straightforward.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing up the business aspect and the risk in the capital markets, because people a lot of times lose sight. That's what's driving all this. That's what's driving. This is the business side, the capital market side, the investors are saying this is information we need to make important decisions. So I think that's always good to kind of bring it back to that perspective. And I appreciate your summary of where we are and where we're going on that. But now I'm going to make a real hard right turn and says, in your spare time, when you're not advancing reporting of sustainability, what are you doing out there anyway?
Right now, I'm spending too much time watching the World Cup. I will say that it's been a great one so far. So,
Well, great.
yeah.
Oh, well, with that, we're going to wrap this up. Do you have any final comments you'd like to leave for our audience today that's listening in about sustainability or sustainability reporting? Anything you would like for them to take away with?
I would just, again, sort of echo the idea that sustainability issues are business issues. They're also public policy issues and philanthropic issues, and we should think of them through those lenses. And then we should, hope that from those different perspectives, that we're actually making sure, this is the accountant in me, making sure that we have the right information to serve those different purposes, serve the businesses that are trying to, to go out there and make money, serve the investors that are trying to make good capital market investment decisions. From a public policy perspective, make sure that we're making sure that, make sure that we're, that companies provide the information that the regulators out there need. And then also think about how can we help the philanthropies out there in the world to ultimately address the the things that they're going to do, because those are also, a major driver of business activity through their channels as well.
Good. Well, Jeff, I want to thank you very much for joining us today on Mac Advantage. As you demonstrated very clearly why I invited you on. Very much an expert in this area. Appreciate your views, and I think appreciate the good work that you do that moves this very important topic forward, so the business community can be informed, as well as the public policy and the citizens as a whole can be informed by that. So again, I want to thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks, John.